My name is Daniel, and this happened about 3 years ago, shortly after my wife and I moved into our first rental home together. It wasn't anything special, just a small, single-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. Beige walls, thin fence, a narrow driveway that barely fit 2 cars. But it was ours, and at that stage of our lives, that felt like everything. The street was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Most of the houses looked lived in, but we rarely saw people outside. No kids playing, no neighbors chatting, just parked cars and closed curtains. At first, we thought it was peaceful. The house to our right belonged to an older couple who waved whenever we passed. But the house on our left stood out. We never saw anyone enter or leave it. The lawn was always trimmed. No packages ever sat on the porch. The lights were almost always off. Still, there was always a car in the driveway. The first time I noticed him was accidental. I was taking out the trash late one evening when I glanced toward the house. One of the front windows had the curtain slightly open, just enough for me to see a figure standing inside. He wasn't waving. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching. The moment I stopped walking, the curtain slid shut. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Maybe he was just curious about new neighbors. People are weird sometimes. Over the next few weeks, though, it kept happening. Sometimes I'd catch him in the window early in the morning before work. Other times, my wife would mention seeing someone watching from upstairs when she let the dog out. Every time it was brief. The second we noticed him, he was gone. We never spoke about it seriously. Not because we weren't uncomfortable, but because neither of us wanted to sound paranoid. That changed one night around 1 a.m. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our bedroom window. I froze, listening. Then I heard the faint sound of metal scraping against metal, like someone testing the fence gate. I quietly got out of bed and peeked through the blinds. There was a man standing in our backyard. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was tall and wearing a dark jacket. He was moving slowly, deliberately, like he knew exactly where he was. I shouted without thinking. The man turned toward the fence, opened the gate, and stepped out calmly. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He just walked away. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I found muddy footprints near the back fence. Fresh ones. A few days later, there was a knock at our door. It was him. He introduced himself as Mark. He smiled the entire time, apologizing if he had scared us the other night. He said kids were always cutting through yards in the neighborhood, and he'd been trying to chase them off. His smile never reached his eyes. I wanted to believe him. I really did. So I thanked him, closed the door, and tried to move on. But after that, things escalated. We'd hear footsteps again, this time closer to the house. Once, the back gate was left wide open when we knew we'd locked it. Another night, our trash bins were knocked over. The final straw came when we woke up to a brick lying in the middle of our living room floor. The window was shattered. No note, no explanation. We called the police. They talked to him. He denied everything. Said he hadn't left his house that night. There wasn't enough evidence to do anything. 2 weeks later, we moved out. We didn't finish the lease. We didn't argue. We packed our things and left while he watched from his window. I still think about that house sometimes. Not because I miss it, but because I don't know how much longer we would have lasted if we stayed. I moved into that apartment by myself in my mid-20s, after taking a job that paid just well enough to afford a 1-bedroom in a quiet complex on the edge of town. It wasn't luxury by any means, but it was clean, affordable, and most importantly, quiet. Or at least it was during the day. The building was old, the kind where you could hear muffled footsteps and doors closing, but nothing unusual enough to complain about. My apartment sat on the first floor, directly beneath another unit. I never met the person who lived above me, but I knew they were there almost immediately. Every night, usually sometime after midnight, I'd hear heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Not quick steps, not casual walking, but slow, deliberate movement that went on for hours. Sometimes it sounded like furniture being dragged a few inches at a time. At first, it just annoyed me. I told myself the person worked nights or had a strange sleep schedule. I used headphones, turned on a fan, and eventually learned to fall asleep with the noise in the background. Then, one night, the sound stopped. Not gradually, completely. No footsteps, no movement, no creaking floors. The silence felt wrong. Days passed, and I realized something else had changed. I never heard the upstairs door open or close anymore. No television, no water running, no signs of life at all. When I checked the mail area, the box labeled with the upstairs apartment number was overflowing. Envelopes stuck out at odd angles, untouched. I mentioned it casually to the property manager when I paid rent, and she paused for a second before telling me the tenant upstairs had moved out a few weeks earlier. That didn't make sense. The noises had continued long after that. A few nights later, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound again. The pacing had returned, but it was different this time. Slower, heavier. Each step pressed into the ceiling, like weight being shifted carefully. Then something small fell from above and landed on my kitchen floor. I turned on the light and found a chunk of crumbling plaster near the center of the room. When I looked up, there was a thin crack in the ceiling, directly above where I usually stood while cooking. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went upstairs. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to the apartment above mine. It looked normal. No damage, no notices taped to it. I knocked lightly, then harder. No answer. As I stood there, I noticed something else. The air near the door smelled faintly metallic, mixed with something sour that made my stomach tighten. I reported everything to management. 2 days later, they entered the apartment with a maintenance worker and a police officer. I wasn't allowed inside, but I watched from the hallway as their expressions shifted. They didn't say much. Later that afternoon, the property manager told me the apartment would be sealed off indefinitely. She wouldn't answer my questions. I moved out before the end of the month. A few weeks later, I ran into one of the officers who had been there that day. He recognized me and said I'd done the right thing by leaving. The noises I'd been hearing, he explained, weren't footsteps. They were coming from inside the walls.